Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to unpack the fascinating life and legacy of Qasim Amin. He was a prominent 19th century jurist who is traditionally celebrated as the Arab world's very first feminist. His writings literally sparked the debate over women's issues across the whole Middle East. But, we really have to ask, is that title actually deserved?
Right off the bat, here's a crucial question. How did the undisputed father of Egyptian feminism become the target of such fierce critique from modern feminist scholars? Today, academics have heavily scrutinized his work, and it's turned his legacy into a really compelling intellectual mystery. So we're going to look at exactly what he argued, why it was so groundbreaking back then, and why historians are now pointing out some massive, glaring flaws in his worldview. Section 1. Roots of a Reformer. To really understand this paradox, let's first look at his background and the specific environment that shaped his worldview. Born in 1863 into a wealthy, aristocratic family with ties to Muhammad Ali, Amin was very much a product of elite society. He studied law in Egypt, then actually scored a government scholarship to study in France. When he came back to Egypt, he was appointed as a jurist in the mixed courts. Now, this was a wild judicial system based partly on Napoleonic code and partly on Islamic law, and it was run predominantly by Westerners. He had a hugely successful legal career, eventually becoming chancellor of the Cairo National Court of Appeals, and in 1908, he even helped co-found what we now know as Cairo University. But what's absolutely fascinating here is his unique blend of intellectual influences. His time in France deeply immersed him in Western philosophy. He was heavily influenced by thinkers like Charles Darwin, Herbert Spencer, and John Stuart Mill, who were actively advocating for social Darwinism and gender equality. But he wasn't just pulling ideas from Europe. He was also profoundly shaped by his mentor, the Islamic modernist Muhammad Abduh. Together, they argued that the moral and intellectual decay of society wasn't the fault of Islam itself, but rather traditionalists who were misinterpreting true Islamic laws. Section 2. Books that sparked debate. Amin channeled all these Western and modernist influences into writings that totally shocked 19th century Egyptian society and helped catalyze the Nahda, or the Great Awakening movement. Just look at how rapidly his public stance evolved in a span of barely 6 years. In 1894, he wrote a book essentially defending Islam's treatment of women against criticism from a French duke. Fast forward just 5 years to 1899, and he drops The Liberation of Women, calling for massive social overhauls like primary education and divorce reform. Then, a year later in 1900, he publishes The New Woman, where he explicitly models his ideal Egyptian woman on Western society, literally using social Darwinism to back up his arguments. It's a dramatic 180, moving from fiercely defending Islamic traditions to explicitly promoting Western social models. Now, you might be wondering, how did he justify this massive shift to his audience? Crucially, he argued that the moral decay of society and the oppression of women were entirely the fault of traditionalists. He insisted that the Quran itself completely supported women's rights to handle their own business affairs and to marry and divorce freely. He actually cited Quranic verses throughout his work to support his belief that elevating women's status would literally improve the entire nation. So, what did he actually propose to fix the system? He pushed for some highly specific legal and social reforms. First, he wanted to abolish the veil, or niqab, arguing it made women more distrusted. He wanted to completely end polygamy, which he said implied an intense contempt for women. He also wanted to reform verbal divorce laws. Get this, according to tradition back then, a husband could validly divorce his wife simply by verbally announcing it 3 times. Amin pointed out that this total lack of legal structure led to sky-high divorce rates in Cairo, with guys accidentally divorcing their wives over simple jokes. And finally, for sure his most famous point, he called for primary education for all women. To justify that last point, educating women, he used a brilliant economic metaphor. He wrote that the present situation resembled a wealthy man locking his gold in a chest when he could be investing it to double his wealth in a short time. Basically, he argued that keeping women uneducated was a massive waste of national resources. Uneducated mothers, he claimed, raised children who would grow up lazy and ignorant. And that cycle, well, that kept Egypt weak and incredibly vulnerable to British colonization. Section 3. The Modern Scholarly Backlash. All of this sounds incredibly progressive for the 1890s, right? But let's pivot now to why modern academics have pushed back so fiercely against giving him that feminist title. Contemporary feminist scholar Layla Ahmed points out a fundamental flaw in Amin's entire premise. Amin lived in a strictly gender-segregated society. Because of his elite social class and, well, his gender, His actual contact with Egyptian women was incredibly limited. We're talking immediate family, a few aristocrats, and maybe prostitutes. That's about it. This means his sweeping claims that ordinary Egyptian women were ignorant or backward were based on basically zero actual evidence. He was diagnosing a massive population he didn't even interact with. Because of this massive blind spot, Ahmed concludes that Amin wasn't actually pushing for feminism at all. Instead, through his harsh critique of Egyptian women and his total praise of European society, he was really just substituting Egyptian male dominance with Western male dominance. Academics call this Western androcentrism. This comparison perfectly captures the core academic divide we're looking at. On one side, you have Qasim Amin's argument. He believed adopting Western models and unveiling women was the only way to build a strong, modern, independent Egyptian nation. But on the flip side, you have Layla Ahmed's critique. She argues that linking the veil to inferiority is a classic Western colonial tactic. By adopting it, Amin wasn't liberating women at all. He was hypocritically aligning with the very British colonizers occupying Egypt, just using women's bodies as tools for his own nationalistic goals. In her view, under his system, the Egyptian woman would still just be a slave to her husband and her nation. Adding another layer to this critique, historian Mona Russell completely challenges Amin's concept of the new woman. She argues that Amin's vision didn't offer women any true independence or individuality. Instead, it forced them to just mimic foreign colonizers in order to be considered acceptable. So to these modern critics, Amin's push for reform was really just his way of trying to integrate into the foreign colonialism that held all the power in Egypt at the time. Section 4. A complex, enduring legacy. So as we evaluate all this source material in today's explainer, we're clearly left with a highly conflicted historical figure. We really cannot ignore this vital piece of context either. Even while he was out there sparking massive dialogues about women's rights and education, Amin still firmly believed that women were inferior to men. Even in his most progressive texts, he explicitly maintained that Egypt needed to remain a patriarchal society and that women should stay under a patriarchal control. His push for primary education wasn't so women could go out and build amazing independent careers. It was literally just so they could be better wives and mothers for the men who were actually building the nation. So, let's end with a provocative thought to leave you pondering. We've seen his groundbreaking, absolute shockwaves of arguments from the 19th century, and we've explored the incredibly sharp, valid critiques from modern scholars. Based on his own writings and these modern evaluations, how should history ultimately remember the Arab world's first feminist? Was he a true champion of women's liberation, fighting the best he could within the confines of his era? Or was he simply a modernizer who used the concept of women's rights as a tool to build a westernized nation? It's a complex, messy debate, but understanding both sides of the source material gives us a vastly richer picture of history.